Hi, this is Indus, founder and CEO of Quolum. Welcome to Quolum Live. Let me introduce the next speaker of this session, Amit Pande. Amit is an enterprise go-to-market expert, and currently he is the Chief Marketing Officer at Aviso. He will discuss a supply chain visibility and preparedness perspective for digital products. He will also describe frameworks that companies can use to rethink marketing and sales supply chains and how companies can prepare talent and processes to de-risk their supply chains. Amit is joining us from San Francisco. Let us hear his views.
The concept of a digital SaaS supply chain has a lot in common with the concept of supply chains in general. In our daily lives, we're actually now familiar with concepts like farm to fork as it applies to the supply chain of food. And, the concept of a Tesla being made in a factory and then being purchased in a certain kind of experience. But when it comes to digital supply chains, I think there's been this notion that digital is less sophisticated than analog. But to take an example, in the last several years, Target.com has driven 10 times more revenues from a growth perspective than real Target. And so a digital SaaS supply chain, is really at the end of the day, a network process, just like a real world supply chain. There's a manufacturer, there's a distributor, there's a retailer, there's an endpoint experience, except instead of bricks and mortar, this is all bits and bytes. So, I would say that if you think about digital supply chains in the concept of a B2B or a B2C environment, that, when you're building a sales technology and you're working on top of Salesforce and many other systems, then you have an entire digital supply chain, for sales. And then on the B2C side, let's say if you are running Target.com, then you probably have hundreds of tools that support everything from the checkout experience to the customer support experience and such. I believe digital supply chains is a concept that we'll see more and more become mainstream and important in this decade that we're in. So, one of the things that's interesting, again, going back to real world supply chains, is that, most of us know that this iPhone or Android device we're using has some Flextronics parts in it. It has some Corning glass in it. And, it has other things that are made, by the Taiwanese manufacturers. In the digital supply chain, we don't know what's behind what we're using. Most people think that they're on Target.com and magically, they select an item and they go on a shopping cart and voila, everything happens. Or that they use a CRM product and they update an opportunity and some magic happens behind the scenes. The reason this topic is becoming more and more mainstream is because of the inflection point that we're in. So if you think back to, let's say, take a 100-year span, right? So think about airlines, think about electricity, think about cars. All of them went through major inflection points where, for example, in the car industry, automatic windows and seat belts at some point became important as we went from early adopters to mass market to pretty much everyone in the world having the opportunity to have a car. In software, those inflection points have been many. Right? So if you remember, we went from $1 billion to $10 billion to we actually crossed $100 billion in SaaS last year. But the other reason why this is such an inflection point, other than just looking at it from the spend that has gone into the space, is that our lives are now impossible to imagine without SaaS. So if you think about the amount of time that we spend in our SaaS tools, like the Zoom tool that we're in, having this conversation in, or the Slack tool that we use to collaborate with each other to have this conversation, we now can't imagine a life without it. And so I believe that the concept of digital supply chains is going to be extremely important in these next 10 years, because by default, now everything, especially in a post-COVID environment, is going to be digital first and analog second. And that means that everything that we do with our customers, with our employees, and those folks in our ecosystems has to almost be, reimagined digital first. And I'll end by saying that if we can understand the importance of digital supply chains for SaaS, it will actually help us both manage the growth as well as, frankly, some of the extreme risks we face with digital transformation. Where if we don't take a supply chain perspective, then we might run into a situation where you have your entire digital transformation be like a house of cards, and you don't actually know what all the cards are. If I think about sales and marketing supply chains, they're very interesting for a couple of reasons. And I think they best illustrate the example was, well, number one is the spend. The spend on sales and marketing tools, if you use just the spend on CRM as a proxy, estimates are that it's about 25% of all enterprise software spend. It's more than databases, it's more than ERPs, and it has powered one of the biggest bellwethers of our time, Salesforce, right? But the irony is that if you think about the supply chain from a CFO or a CEO perspective, most CFOs and CEOs, when they think about sales, they think CRM. So literally, they think the entire supply chain is whatever is in their CRM, whether it's the leads coming in, whether it's the leads turning to opportunities, whether it's those opportunities turning to accounts, and those accounts expanding. All of these are just kinds of data that you would, of course, enter in a CRM. But the reality is that there is a huge factor difference in just the understanding and perception and the reality. So the perception is that you're using one CRM tool, which is costing you, say, $200 per user per month. The reality is that you're not using one CRM tool. In fact, many companies are using multiple CRM tools, including homegrown CRMs, and there are at least 100 to 200, in some cases, several hundred tools that are built around the CRM, on top of the CRM, underneath the CRM, to go around the CRM. And so you might ask, well, why do all these tools really exist? They exist because CRM is a bookkeeping tool, and it's a great bookkeeping tool that is now, as old as me, I think. And in its 40th year, if you think about it as a tool, it does a good job of storing data. But real work is not bookkeeping. Real work is sense making in the real world, responding to customers and prospects in real time, and the way sales reps deal with it, the way sales managers deal with it, the way sales enablement and productivity teams deal with it, and the way CFOs and CROs deal with it, they all need purpose-built tools because they have purpose-built workflow needs that CRM cannot satisfy for them. So to give you a further example, right, if you're a sales rep, you're using something, right, like Outreach or Salesloft. If you're a sales manager, you're using something like Anaplan or using something like Exactly. If you're sales enablement, you're using MindTickle or Showpad. And if you're someone at the CFO, CRO level, you're using an inside sales or using a tool like, Aviso or Clary. All these tools are literally just 2 or 3 examples out of dozens that exist for people to choose from. There are, in fact, 575 CRMs, sort of on this left-hand side that I mentioned, and there are at least 5 to 7,000 tools, in fact, even more in the MarTech space. And so if I go back from a supply chain perspective, what this means is that the supply chain for sales software is, number one, a lot more complex than you thought it is as a CEO. Number two, it is bigger and richer. Number three, the number of integrations that actually exist within these tools, if you think of them as apps in themselves, this literally means that you thought your supply chain was, one giant machine in your backyard for sales, but actually it's 500 different pelotons in your backyard. And so I think what this means is that, frankly, from the CFO and CEO lens as well, we don't know what's really going on. So we have a visibility problem. We don't know how we can use all these tools to, like really manage our sales supply chain as CROs, which means we have a predictability problem. And, frankly, if you can't solve visibility and predictability, you can't solve the control problem. And, these are some of the things that I think will become very important. And if we solve them for sales and marketing tools, I think it will help, because these tools are giving us some inspiration on what we can then do for HR tools, finance tools, and other kinds of tools where the spend is a lot less than sales today, but where the spend is likely to be as much as sales is in this decade. So, it's a really interesting idea of applying the concept of risk from the analog world to the digital world. In the analog world, we talk about not enough masks, for example, being available during COVID. I know I haven't been able to get an N95 mask for at least 4 months. I was only 4 months too late. And if you think about the way you make masks in large volume, you have to worry about cloth, you have to worry about fabric, you have to worry about metal. Now, in the real world supply chains, we have an understanding of this. We know that, for example, if our Southeast Asia suppliers get affected, we could possibly switch the suppliers to Central America. In the digital world, frankly, we're at a much more primitive level in understanding risk. And so let's break this down into what kinds of risks exist. You know, um, so if you take that concept of what I just described with masks, but you now apply that to, let's say, sales tools, the first risk is that of visibility. You don't actually know how many tools you have. So now, at a simplistic level, you could say that if I don't know, what percentage of my CRM licenses are unused, or if I don't know what 1/3 of my sales tool spend, where that's coming from, that certainly creates a financial burden because you're basically spending on what you don't know. But I think it goes deeper than this. So if you think about secondary and tertiary suppliers, in this case suppliers of data, let's say if I have built integrations on top of Salesforce and 5 other systems which are actually spread across 5 different geographies in the world. There are also other newer kinds of risks that exist. For example, data risk. I mean, what if your data is flowing through or is resident in a country which is going through a completely new kind of either pandemic turmoil or geopolitical turmoil? That's something that we don't even talk about, those kinds of things today. So I would say that that affects your predictability because, for example, if even if I can trust my Salesforce to be 100% all the time, what about this new tool that I just picked up in Spain or Italy or China or India or frankly even Canada, where now perhaps that company itself is at risk because there's a certain kind of talent risk that is completely new and is a black swan that no one anticipated. Um, and then, I think the third and the biggest kind of risk that companies right now have is, ultimately what I would call the value risk. And what I mean by the value risk is that, we're spending all this money as input, but it's not really clear what the utilization and the output is. And at some point, it means that there is a battle looming between, to continue with that example of sales tools, a battle looming between the CRO and the CFO. Because the CRO so far has basically come and said, look, Miss CFO, you want me to drive growth? Give me more tools, give my people more tools. And the CFO said, okay, you know what? Keep driving growth, keep spending on tools. Now we've suddenly reached this point, especially during COVID, where people are saying, wait a minute, why are my SaaS costs as high as my healthcare costs? And so now it's not enough for buyers or sellers to say, hey, if you buy this 17th tool, you will be able to drive win rates up by 15%. Because guess what? Every vendor says that. And so I think that if we can start at least building a conceptual framework around how we can think of visibility, predictability, and control in the context of these digital SaaS supply chains for HR, for finance, for sales, for marketing, and frankly for many other functions as well in a company. For example, the way you manage your channel, um, uh, it will really help us, build a better future for SaaS because the next 10 years, whatever SaaS will do, will be built upon the current generation of SaaS. And I think it's high time that we learned from the real world supply chain and started talking about how to bring in that level of just understanding into our digital supply chains as well. I think there are a couple of things that we can do from a process perspective and a couple of things we can do from a tools perspective. I think from a process perspective, this is the best time to actually start mapping out that supply chain. this is the best time to start asking your CMO, hey, what does your marketing stack look like? And just acknowledge that most parts of your business may have a Franken stack that people don't even know what they don't know. You know, so we'd start with, I would say, starting with the visibility problem of just like knowing what you have, doing an inventory of all the tools that you have. Then I would go a step further and using the language of tier one, tier two, tier three suppliers from the real world, where we talk about, not just the suppliers that are, let's say, in China or some other region, but the suppliers that they outsource to and the ones they outsource to. Do you have something like that going on in your world? Is your marketing team basically two people inside the marketing team and 20 agencies which are using their own tools in different parts of the world, and your data is essentially in many more places than it should be. You know, the perimeter of your data is now much broader. So I would start with that level of mapping as well. Oftentimes, this is an exercise that doesn't have an owner for it. So I would recommend that if you're the CEO, you appoint someone in the company that is closest to operations and say, hey, just take this on as a special project. Maybe get an intern to help, with this analysis. I would also say, from a predictability perspective, maybe we start like thinking about backups, alternatives. So going back to the example of, if your foam or cloth runs out in Central America, you can quickly switch suppliers to a different part of the world. Can you do that with your digital SaaS supply chain? If your talent acquisition product, whichever talent acquisition product you're spending a lot of money on to attract candidates today, what if it goes down? If it goes down, do you own your own data? Do you know where your data is? I think the idea is that data is the new oil is in fact an outdated idea, because data transforms itself and changes itself all the time. So I would definitely say, do a very deep forensics on where your customer data is and where your employee data is, and whether the apps and the SaaS tools you're using for this kind of data, if they need to be ported to another tool because there's some existential risk that these companies face, can you manage that risk? And can you manage that risk in a way that you can manage it not just in the Americas and in Europe and in Asia, but literally, if you have a global team, you can manage it across. And then the final point I'll make is that, in terms of managing supply chain risk, in the real world, we have purpose-built tools for this. So if you look at the flow of private equity money and venture capital money into supply chain tools in just the last 4 months, PitchBook has a great post recently that the hockey stick is starting to go up. Everyone that was building supply chain software for the real world is seeing a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, because everyone's realizing this problem is complex, and the problem is here with us. It's going to be here with us in the next 10 years. So if you want your digital supply chain to be managed in a similar way to real world supply chains, start getting purpose built tools. Don't rely only on Excel. Excel and its pivot tables will only go so far. And there is a category of new tools that I believe is starting to emerge, that I would encourage every CXO to look at, so that they can spend going forward with more confidence and have the confidence that their company operations don't go down just because one node in the network goes down. And I think we'll just start seeing that level of sophisticated thinking, hopefully, in this decade, with this next generation of supply chain tools for digital supply chains. I'll start with the marketing tools. As someone who's had to spend on these tools and evaluate these tools, I can tell you the problem is real. There's only so much cognitive bandwidth we have to absorb these new tools. Now, the tools seem to be doing fine. Yesterday, I learned that HubSpot is at 765 million in revenues and has nearly 100,000 customers. There is room for a lot of growth in MarTech still, but I think that in the next 10 years, we'll see a lot of categories actually almost collapse. So in the same way that the universe goes through expansion and contraction cycles, I think that in MarTech, we have a contraction cycle is overdue. And I think when this contraction cycle hits us, certain parts of the cycle will just contrast a lot faster. Startups will get acquired, very fast by each other. Some startups will just die. I think that if you go back to this idea of like bookkeeping and sense making that we spoke about, the sense making tools, in my view, have a brighter future than the bookkeeping tools, because at some point everyone will have their own customer data platform, and now it's a question of, hey, what do I do with it? I see this consolidation happen more bluntly and ruthlessly in martech than in sales tech. I think in sales tech, my sense is that the spend will continue for a little while longer before the consolidation happens. Um, but specifically, what I see happen is that, I see that we will probably see more and more companies go into a buy plus build versus just a buy model. And what I mean by that is that they will basically say, like, okay, between Salesforce and one of the 570 other CRMs out there, what if I take one that is not as sophisticated as Salesforce might be, but hey, I can really, like, use this as clay to build something around it that I can own fully, and where I own my entire data fabric. I think we'll see a lot of that happen in sales. I also do think that perhaps there is a new kind of stack that will, you know, historically a lot of tools have, like ABM tools, have fallen in the crack between sales and marketing tools. I think this middle, in fact, is where a lot of the value will grow, because also the idea that sales and marketing is basically one giant function is going to gain more steam. For example, at Cisco a couple of years ago, they collapsed sales and marketing under the same leader, and Jerry Elliott became their first um, uh, their first CMO slash chief sales officer, and the first woman to hold that post there. And it's a brilliant idea. And I think that, in fact, I would, though you didn't ask the question, I'll take it one step forward and say that I actually expect that the spend on customer success tools, marketing tools, and sales tools will all consolidate under one head, which is perhaps better, because then the holy grail of having a single view of the customer is more likely to happen in this decade than previous